Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming and joining us today. We have a lot to cover, so we are going to get underway. Hopefully we know each other. But if we haven't met, my name is Matt Peterson. I'm the Executive Director of NAGDA. Our topic today is an important one. It's the NAGDA board recently went to Capitol Hill to advocate on your behalf. We learned a lot from those meetings, and we want to share some of those insights to you. I will be joined today by one of the best, one of our favorites, Michael Krebs, principal at Groom Law. Welcome, Michael. Good to see you again, as always.
For having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Some quick logistics for everybody. As with all of our webinars, we are recording this presentation. The recording will be emailed to all registrants. So if you registered, it will be in your inbox tomorrow. You'll be muted for the duration of this webinar, but please submit any questions you have through the Q&A box at the bottom. Your questions are only going to be visible to me and to Michael, so feel free to send those anytime, and we'll get to as many as we possibly can during the time that we have today. I also want to take a minute to thank our visionary and premier sponsors. There they are. NAGDA is a mission-driven nonprofit, as you all know, and our goal is to be your collective voice, especially in the legislative realm. We couldn't do that mission without the generous support of the companies you see listed here. So thank you to all of you. If you're from one of the sponsors companies, thank you for letting us complete our mission. So we're going to talk a little bit about that mission today as it relates to our legislative program. And we'll start with a little bit of a recap of the visits that the board and I and the folks from Groom went on earlier this month. So we met with both House and Senate offices. We met with Finance, Ways and Means, and Workforce, Health and Labor, and Pensions, and also the Banking Committee chairs and staff for each of the Democrat and Republican sides of the aisle. So we go on that meeting every year so that we can sit down with those folks and better understand what's happening with Capitol Hill, which is always an interesting conversation to have, and what's happening with our priorities, express our priorities, and see what the odds are that there's going to be any legislation pending this year. So our priorities, hopefully you caught those. We sent them out a couple weeks ago. Our priorities for this year were pretty simple. We know that a lot has been asked of you all recently. Secure 2.0 had about 92 provisions, I think. Secure 1, which was just a few years before that, had dozens of provisions itself. So we didn't ask for a whole lot new when we went to Capitol Hill and met with the Senate and House staffs. Really, we were just asking for help for you all to implement parts of Secure 2.0 for government plans. So we'll get right into it and talk about the one that we got the most questions on for over the last couple of years, and the most questions on for this webinar as well, which is Section 603 of Secure 2.0. It was a big topic in our meetings. I'm going to break some hearts. For those of you who don't know the sections by memory, that is the Roth catch-up provision. So for those of you who've been tracking that over the last couple of years, we've sent many letters, worked with the regulators, worked with the congressional staff to try to get some relief on Roth catch-ups, $145,000. If you are over that income threshold, your catch-up contribution is going to be turned into Roth. Like I said, I'm going to break some hearts early on and just let you know that that is not going away. That is going to remain in effect. The amount is not going to change. I know that some of our members have asked about that $145,000 line. We expressed our dissatisfaction with it and said, hey, this, if you're on the coasts especially, this can affect, not just your high income employees, but into your middle income employees as well. They understand that, but they also know that they cannot change and are not going to change that provision of the law. So I want to make sure that that's clear right from the get-go. If you showed up to the webinar hoping that there would be some, I think one of the questions put it, are they going to abandon that provision? That is not going to happen. So, Michael, there are some kind of technical reasons for that, right? We talk about it, and the term that's used often in Congress is a pay for. This provision is considered a pay for. Can you kind of explain what that means and why Section 603 in particular, and a couple others are so sticky and aren't going anywhere because they are considered pay-fors?
Happy to do that. So Congress has a weird way of thinking about legislation, and it's a little counterintuitive in some respects. They basically, every time there's a piece of legislation, they have to figure out how much it's going to cost, and some of that's direct government outlays, right? You're going to build more Navy ships or something like that, and some of it's indirect costs or that are incurred through the government's failure to collect revenue it otherwise would have. So tax cuts fall in that budget. If I cut taxes by 10%, there's foregone revenue. They score it as the bill is costing something. For retirement, our entire deferral, the entire tax treatment of the system costs money for the government. When you expand it, it costs money, and when you contract the benefit, it saves money for the federal government. And that's kind of a silly kind of result because obviously the government's not actually spending money, but there's foregone revenue. And so for big bills like Secure 2, where they have a bunch of provisions that have costs, they will often want to offset those costs with what we typically refer to as pay-fors, and that's revenues, provisions that raise revenue. And in this case, the moving from a traditional contribution, a pre-tax contribution to a plan, to a post-tax contribution to a plan, raises revenue because it front loads when people pay taxes. So rather than deferring not paying taxes up front and deferring the taxation to when the money comes out of the plan, people are paying it immediately to the government, and the government only looks at 10 years. And so what that looks like when you move from traditional to Roth is as if the government is raising a bunch of money by increasing taxes on people. It's not really true over the long term, but that's how they view it. And so it makes these provisions very sticky because if you want to get rid of them, you then have to find a way to replace that lost revenue. And that's just a challenge.
Yeah. And so it is hard to explain, right? It's hard to understand how does something that went from pre-tax to Roth really gain the government revenue. It just gains it in that 10-year window, right? So for this group of people who makes over $150,000 or $145,000, those people making their catch-up contributions as Roth contributions brings in money today that would have been realized outside of that 10-year window, right? And so that gives you a number to kind of hang your hat on. And who creates that number, just for reference?
There's a committee called the Joint Committee on Taxation that estimates the impact of revenue bills of taxing tax bills. And then there's a second organization called CBO, the Congressional Budget Office that lays on another layer that kind of takes into consideration agency outlays, behavioral effects. And so those two together, the JCT and CBO, they come up with these scores for bills.
And so the way that I had heard it, we had some questions early on about why $145,000, why was that the number? And the response that I've generally gotten was that was the number that worked for that balance of, how much revenue do we need to claim for this bill to make it work or cost neutral. And so if you think about it from the other side of the coin, then any change to that, especially raising the income limit or getting rid of it entirely, that all that revenue kind of gets lost again, or gets deferred and gets taken away. And so all of the people who are writing those bills, that's the number they care about most, right? And so they're very laser focused on making sure that revenue number is not a negative, doesn't cost, right? And so they are unfortunately pretty unwilling to bend on the Roth catch-up in this case for exactly that reason. So we did talk about, in the conversations that I had, we talked about, can government be carved out even, late in the game? Could we change that $145,000 to something higher? All of those were met with the same answer, that it would cost too much money in tax terms. So the gist of that, it's kind of a long explanation to say we're stuck with it, and we're currently stuck with it in the form that we have it. The IRS gave us a lot of help to be honest. They gave us a couple of years. They didn't have to do that. You know, we were very appreciative of the fact that they did. I think they recognized the urgency of the situation and gave us a couple extra years to implement. I know a lot of you are waiting to, you know, really get into the implementation phase until you have further guidance. They are not going to mess with the effective date anymore. The IRS has been pretty clear about that. I don't know if you've heard anything different, Michael, but I think they've given us everything they're going to give. Anything?
Right. I think that's right. In fact, they've said multiple times, they've been pretty emphatic that this they're not going to give more relief here. I think they went out on a limb to provide a 2-year delay. They arguably didn't really have authority to do that, but recognizing the technical challenges, they punted a couple years, which was very, very nice. I think we all appreciated that, but they've been pretty strident in the fact that they don't have any more leeway.
Yeah. But they did, you know, we did communicate to the staff that further guidance is very necessary, that you all need more information, especially the state multis. So multi-employer plans, they know that you need more information before you can start to move forward on your implementation. They also know that for those plans that are Section 218 exemptions from Social Security, they need to get guidance out to help you understand, are you actually exempted from this provision? There was some kind of draft. Maybe we're going to do this guidance that said, we're thinking about exempting those who don't have a FICA wage from this provision, but we don't have that set in stone yet. And they know that they have to make some of those determinations before any of you can move forward. So they are aware of that. We press that the sooner we get that information, the better. The IRS is a pretty busy group. And so I know that they are working on it, but we don't have any timeline. I don't know if you've heard any timeline, Michael, for anything, any kind of further guidance, but it didn't seem like it was imminent.
Yeah, they keep, and they will keep saying soon. That's what they will say. But, that could be months, if not years. So I don't think it didn't sound like anything was imminent.
Well, hopefully it's not years because we only have
Yeah, right.
so
Exactly.
much time left. So, but we will be continuing to press them to get that guidance. But for now, expect to implement by the end of next year. So another provision that we discussed with them was the emergency savings provision. So that was kind of a unique part of Secure 2.0, and it was written in kind of a way that didn't necessarily help government plans. Michael, you want to talk at all about what pension-linked emergency savings accounts are and how some of the writing of the bill kind of caused confusion for government plans?
So pension-linked emergency savings accounts, which I'm just going to call PLESs because it's a little easier. It's quite a mouthful. They're an account that's intended to be established within a defined contribution plan that is a Roth account. So it's post-tax dollars that go in there up to a limit that a participant can draw down at any time for any reason without penalty. So you go up to $2,000 and you can take the money out whenever you want. And the goal is to give people some liquid savings so that they can deal with emergencies as they come up, emergency expenses, without taking distributions from the 401k that are penalized, or having to take withdrawals, hardship withdrawals, or something like that. I think there was a recognition in Congress that people sometimes lack sufficient savings to deal with emergencies, and Congress wanted to address that. And there had been a push from an industry to do some of this outside of the plan, to have kind of an employer provided benefit that's basically a savings account. But Congress wanted to incentivize this to be incorporated into the plan so they could be managed together. And so they drafted this bill and put it out. And from the text, it's pretty clear that they intended governmental plans to be included. I mean, it specifically says, it references governmental plans. But there's this odd provision, and it's largely because of the committee's jurisdiction and how things were drafted. There's an odd provision that says you can do this if you meet the requirements of an ERISA section. And the way people have read that is to say, well, if we're not covered by ERISA, then we can't have these accounts. And at the time this was passed, that was not the the position, I think, of many staffers. People thought it generally covered governmental plans. I think that position may have changed a bit for folks on the Hill, but regardless, there's an open question about whether governmental plans can do pluses, and that is just the fact that there's regulatory uncertainty has basically kind of made people take a pause on those accounts.
Yeah, and in the conversations I had, it seems very much that they are now saying that they apply to government plans, but there seems to be interest in having them to apply to government plans for exactly the reasons we were talking about with previously with the Roth catch-up. So the emergency savings accounts would be Roth dollars, right? Like these would be after-tax dollars. And so when they looked at the score under the same kind of circumstances from the CBO, from the Congressional Budget Office, there was actually a positive score for adding governmental plans to emergency savings accounts. So they look, the congressional staffers who were writing this, they go, hey, that's a pretty good deal. We'll try to get this into some future legislation. But the conversations that I had was they don't feel like that, or they are pretty clear that it does not apply to government plans as it's written right now.
And I think part of that gets to the question we were just talking about pay-fors, that that by permitting pluses, it actually raises revenue because it takes a portion of the assets contributed to the plan that would be pre-tax and converts them to Roth. And so because of that, you get a situation whereby expanding this to governmental plans would actually raise revenue from a congressional scoring perspective. And they can use it as a pay-for then to offset other costs in legislation. So I think it's partially some confusion around the language, and now congressional staff and others have decided that it is helpful for them to have future legislation that expands it to governmental plans.
Yeah, and if you want to make some friends in Congress, to have something that increases the increases the budget, right? Increases,
right.
It pays for something. We did get a question about which section that was. I believe it's 127 for pluses, if you're scoring at home. So those two, we bring those up, and I know we've talked about them often. I know there's still more information, and we'll continue to talk about them because you need information. We'll need more guidance. There may be more movement on the pluses in the future. They fit with our legislative priorities that NAGDCA put together as we talked to congressional staff, because a couple of things that we learned from the situation was, one, typically these bills have longer timelines for government plans. That was left out of some parts of Secure 2.0, including the Roth catch-up provision. If that had been in there from the beginning, it would have saved us a lot of time. So we emphasized with Congress and made very clear that every bill going forward should have some longer timelines for government. If you want to implement earlier, you always can, but knowing that a lot of our plans are statutory plans, there has to be legislation passed, or at least meetings that can't just happen right away. We can't work on the same short timelines that private plans often can. Also, as Michael mentioned, depending on the committee, some of the committees we talk to, their jurisdiction and their relation to the retirement world is purely through ERISA. And so that was part of the reason that the pluses were maybe not written for us as much. And so we just reemphasized with them that anything that touches retirement has to go beyond ERISA and has to acknowledge and account for the fact that government plans are not covered by ERISA and need to be considered. So reiterated those points, which we've reiterated many times, but I think we'll need to continue to reiterate in the future. And the reception, of course, on all of those was good, and we made some progress, I think. Another aspect, our last priority that we've talked about a few times, was the inclusion of collective investment trusts and 403(b) plans. So for those of you who might have a 403(b), you would know that you are only allowed to offer mutual funds or annuities in those plans. And so we've been talking with Congress for quite a while to try to get collective investment trusts added to that offering, so that you can do the same thing that all the 457 and 401A plans under the government purview can do, 401Ks also, and offer those usually cheaper vehicles. The conversations that I had about those were pretty good. It seemed like there is interest in those in those topics or in adding collective investment trusts, but and there may be a bill. I think they're working on a bill right now, and they're looking for co-sponsors to see if they can move that forward. And so maybe Michael, you can kind of be helpful on describing like how does that process work? Because a lot of times, those single bills will kind of be thrown out there. There have been a lot of legislative proposals that are out, sort of offered in the space. But we talk about, sometimes they'll need a bigger vehicle to be connected to at the end of the year, because it's very rare that like a single provision, a single bill will be passed. Can you explain how that process works a little bit, and why we're always kind of waiting until the end of the year to focus on a lot of this stuff?
Yeah, sure. So I think the short answer is that legislating is very hard. And it is hard to build consensus, particularly in the Senate, where there's a filibuster and you need 60 votes to pass legislation generally, not always generally. And it's difficult to get 60 votes. People have lots of different interests, and the bill may be perfectly fine. It may be a great bill and everyone may support it, yet they still may vote against it for other reasons. They want their provision included. They have, they've got some spending they want to put in the package. So it makes it very difficult to pass little tiny standalone bills because there's always somebody in the Senate who can block it. And that means you have to figure out a strategy for cobbling together enough bills to garner enough support in Congress to get the thing through. And that often occurs, the strategy from leadership is often to bundle together a lot of bills and stick them on a bill that must pass. So you'll have a bill to fund the government, must pass every year. You have to keep the lights on. And they'll add a lot of extraneous or smaller bills and other pieces of legislation to that package because it's got to pass, and they know they'll be able to get the votes, and they'll see how many other bills it can take along with it. And that that is a kind of a newer phenomenon in Congress. Maybe, it's not maybe the historic norm of how things operate, but it's the reality now. If you wanted to pass just this bill, it would be very difficult. But if it got tacked onto a big spending bill at the end of the year, you might be able to get it through.
Okay, that's helpful. So so that it was mostly what we talked about in 2024 and for this year. Maybe a little prognostication from you, Michael, on whether you see anything moving, like any actual movement on stuff. And then we'll talk about one of those big bills that looks like it's going to be on the horizon in 2025. But are you feeling, from what you're seeing, and we'll talk about this more at the conference, hopefully you're all coming to Phoenix. We'll have maybe a little better sense then of what the end of the year is going to look like. But there's also technical corrections that were part of Secure 2.0. So those are usually very kind of minute changes to just clarify things that don't actually touch on the substance of the bill. Can you explain, what those are, and then whether there's any chance in what is shaping up to be, again, a fairly contentious election year, of actual legislation getting passed by this year sometime?
So on the technical corrections piece, before the ink was even dry on Secure 2.0, congressional staff knew that there were technical problems with some of the provisions. And they range from everything from kind of typos, very small missing commas, things like that, to more substantive things, like on the Roth catch-up provision, the way the statute reads, it could be interpreted to have eliminated catch-ups altogether. And so that is obviously not what they intended, and not what how the IRS is going to interpret it, but they want to go back and clean up some of those things. But these are very technical changes. These are not substance, and they require sign off from Republicans and Democrats in the labor and tax committees in both chambers of Congress. So that's 8 different members of Congress, senior leadership, on a bipartisan basis who have to sign off on it. So there's nothing really substantive in that bill. It's agreed to. They put out a draft. They may make some changes. It can't, for the reasons we discussed a few minutes ago, it can't pass by itself. And so they are going to try and put it onto a bigger spending bill. And that gets to Matt's second question was, well, is anything happening? this year. What exactly is going to happen, and does that have a chance? And election years are incredibly difficult. At this time of the election cycle, sometimes they call it silly season in Congress because it's a period where it's mostly posturing. The big legislation that they have to pass is mostly done. And so they're left putting forward bills that show voters what they would do if they had full control of government. That's basically, or embarrass the other party, something like that. And so it's a lot of posturing, and that means very little legislating happens between now and the election. They'll be in for 2 more months, then they'll disappear for the summer. They'll come back briefly after Labor Day, and then they'll be gone for the elections again. And so everything that they're going to have to do that's must pass will get punted until after the election, including likely the big appropriations bill to keep the government funded. The government's on a October 1st fiscal year, so it runs from October 1st to September 30th, which is kind of an odd fiscal year, but it means that approximately a month before the election, the funding for the government will expire, and they'll have to re-up that to keep the agencies functioning. And they'll do that, but they'll usually do it by punting everything until either after the election or until the next Congress. And it really just depends on who wins the election and how things shape out. If Biden remains president and Democrats keep the Senate and Republicans have the House, then they'll keep legislating after the election just like they are now. If the power shifts in any way, then the party that's going to come into power will want to wait until next year to act because they feel like they'll get a better deal the following year. So it's kind of a difficult year election years are difficult to predict in terms of productivity for Congress. And that's why in a normal world, we would pass this technical corrections bill without any sweat at all, because it's just technical corrections. But because of the election and the politics around it, it becomes a little more difficult.
Okay. And so stay tuned. We will give another update as we get closer to the election at the conference in September. But next year, so maybe mixed prospects, I guess, for anything moving this year. There will be some bills. Obviously, there are going to have to be some bills at the end of the year, right? And so maybe some of this stuff gets put into it. Hard to say. Like you said, it depends on how things shake out with probably some very close elections. But next year, there is kind of a vehicle that is moving forward that is going to force some change in the tax regime. And so a lot of the 2017 tax cuts are set to expire in 2025, and that's going to a little bit force everybody to at least take a look at tax policy and figure out what they want to do. Again, it will depend very much on who's in power in the different chambers. But so what's happening next year, Michael? Why is that kind of a big one for tax policy? And then what does that have to do with retirement?
So when they passed the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act in 2017, that was the kind of big tax reform bill they did. And they did it through a process called reconciliation, which is kind of an expedited process to get bills through Congress when they have to do with revenue and the budget. But there are rules to using that expedited process. And without getting into all the technicalities, some of those rules are that policies have to expire. So both for that procedural reason and to limit the cost of the bill to some extent, they kind of have some of the cuts sunset in 2025. And it's pretty heavily weighted towards the ones that hit taxpayers, individuals. So a bunch of the kind of personal exemptions and things like that are expiring. So absent action by Congress, a lot of people will see their taxes go up. And so that was an intentional way to structure it, knowing that will create political pressure on Congress to extend the tax cuts because people don't love having their taxes raised. And they then have to figure out what they're going to do. And generally, Congress doesn't have to pay for anything, but they generally try to at least offset most of the costs. Some of it's real math, some of it's funny math, but they're trying to offset it. And here, they're going to need over $4 trillion if they want to offset the full cost. That's an unfathomable amount of money for anybody, even for the U.S. government. It's just it's a huge amount of money. One, at least 5 or 6 years ago, a 1% decrease in the corporate tax rate only was $100 billion cost. So, I mean, if you kind of extrapolate that, and we need
Yeah,
4 trillion, it's a lot. And so how does that relate to retirement? Well, retirement, we have a large tax incentive for retirement savings, and that tax incentive can be changed, as we've talked about, to try and raise revenue or decrease the cost to the government of the incentive. And because of that, it's always at risk of being tinkered with, so that they can raise revenue to pay for other unrelated policies.
okay. And so, when we're talking about, and the number that I saw was $4.6 trillion, right?
Right.
That is a big number. It seems like just about anything in those cases is going to be on the table. Have you heard what are maybe some of the more like extreme circumstances that they would consider? Maybe it's not going to happen, but what are some of the things that they talk about when they talk about raising even in the neighborhood of that kind of money?
Or so in our world, there's all kind of, they're going to have to do some really major things. I think even the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee has said publicly tax rates for corporations are going up in 2025. So there's going to be some big things. But on the retirement side, they talk a lot about they could do big things. They could eliminate the tax incentive completely. That's unlikely to happen. I mean, that would just decimate the system, and nobody really wants that. But they do, they do frequently talk about proposals to move from a pre-tax to a post-tax retirement system. So, move from traditional to Roth contributions, at least for employee deferrals. That would have obviously a pretty material effect on the system. It's unclear how that would shake out, but it can raise a lot of revenue if we took the whole system and moved it from pre-tax to post-tax. I mean, that would look like a giant tax increase from a congressional scoring perspective. And so that's the most common one they talk about, but there's a lot of tweaks around the edges. And we've already talked about one here, right? When they needed revenue to pay for Secure 2.0, they looked at the Roth catch-up contributions. So they didn't do everything Roth. They did the catch-up contributions, and that number can go up and down. And there's other places where you can do similar things, where you can kind of tinker with inputs so that there's less or more participation in plans, meaning bigger or smaller tax expenditures. So there's a lot on the table that they can do. Most of it, candidly, none of us are going to be all that happy with. It's going to have a negative impact on the retirement system.
Yeah. So we got a good question, and we'll try to be really clear because this is very complex stuff. And the question was, where did that $4.6 million number come from? I'm going to throw a T on the beginning of that one and say that it was $4.6 trillion. And so where that number comes from is the same process that we talked about in the beginning. So anytime the government is foregoing revenue or creating a program that brings in revenue, the Congressional Budget Office looks at it and creates a score. They'll say, here's how much money this is going to cost or not cost. So because those provisions of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act from 2017 are set to expire in 2025, if they go away, all of that tax money, most of those were reductions in tax or deferrals in tax. So if those provisions go away, the federal government suddenly gets a whole lot of tax revenue. Like Michael said, a lot of that tax revenue is coming from all of us. So we typically don't like that all that much. And so politicians don't want to see that number, they don't want to see taxes go up by just letting those provisions expire or letting those provisions sunset. So the work that they're going to be trying to do is to figure out how much of that money can they continue to not receive as the federal government by, keeping taxes lower or offering, and it's not just cuts. So, I think it's important to remember it includes, that's why retirement is part of it, because if you're tax deferring money into a pre-tax retirement account, and you're paying that, those taxes 30 years from now, the Congressional Budget Office doesn't look at those taxes that are paid 30 years from now. They just look at the money that you're not paying today. So that's why things like the deferral limit of, $23, $24, $25,000, they look at that and say, well, if that person who is saving $25,000 was just paying tax on it, that's money that the government could have. Now, that would be wildly unpopular, and so there's not a lot of incentive to do it. But there are other programs. So in the conversations that we had on Capitol Hill, there are other programs that they're really trying to still push forward, right? They're still trying to think about things like, how do we get more people saving for retirement? And one of the things that they tend to do when they want more people to save for retirement is to offer a tax incentive. So you all may have seen that part of Secure 2.0 was a match from the federal government called the Savers Match. It was means tested, which means it checks how much money you're making. So if you make below a certain amount of money and you're saving for your retirement, the government's going to give you some money. That hasn't kicked in yet, but it's on the table. And there's interest in expanding those kind of things to help people who aren't able to save or who have a hard time saving enough money in their retirement plan save more. If you do that, that adds to that score. So, one of the conversations that I had was, yes, this is it's a $4 trillion tax bill, but we also have other stuff that we'd like to get done. And so that would actually add to that number. But then, the other side of that is, what do they take away and what changes? And so, like Michael was saying, if you turn, say, all of the accounts to Roth, immediately you get that tax money today because it's after tax contributions. And so that would be a big positive score on those budget numbers. So, or on those score numbers. So retirement is kind of a big pot of money, right? Because there's a lot of tax deferrals that come from the retirement space. And so what we kind of surmised and what was fairly evident in the conversations that we had were that over the past couple of years, our priorities have very much been about improving the system, kind of like we getting rid of the 457 first day of the month, or adding, emergency savings accounts, doing things like matches for student loan provisions. I think those additive things are probably not as much on the radar for us as much as defense. We're going to be playing a little bit of defense in the next couple of years and trying to make sure that things like Rothifying all retirement contributions aren't on the table as options to try to pay for this tax bill. So hopefully that clears up some of that question. Anything you want to add there, Michael?
That's exactly right.
Okay. So anything else you want to add about next year? So we've seen there have been some pretty surprising proposals, right? Like a 401k for all, an auto IRA program for everybody. Are there any that you're worried about, or anything out there that you're kind of seeing that you go, ooh, if this, this seems to have legs, or we really need to be on the lookout for these kind of things as we get into the next year?
So I do think there is a bipartisan concern about the coverage gap on the retirement side, and meaning that there's a material portion of the workforce that's just not covered by a retirement plan for a variety of reasons. And so there has been a push in Congress, growing push to find ways to either incentivize or compel access for the uncovered workforce. It started years and years ago, and a lot of states have programs to kind of require employers to provide access to an automatic savings program. Congress has been looking at those things for a very long time, and they used to be entirely partisan. They have become bipartisan proposals to some extent more recently, and there are two flavors of that. Flavor one is an automatic IRA, so a requirement that an employer must provide a retirement plan, and if they don't, they have to automatically enroll their workforce into a government facilitated private sector run IRA, so payroll deduction IRA. And then there's a second proposal, which is a bipartisan proposal to create kind of an analog to the federal government's thrift savings plan, kind of a large federally run plan that would be available to private sector employers. The legislation is a little complex, and a lot of it's driven by changes to tax incentives for that plan. But the basic idea is creating a public option for retirement that for the private sector. None of that, it doesn't touch the public sector at all. It's just a private sector coverage gap that they're looking at. But both of those proposals have been out there for a while, and I wouldn't say they're necessarily gaining steam, but they have a little steam behind them.
Yeah. So you think the universal 401k isn't just a complete toss off, that there's going to be some conversation about that?
I think there will be conversation about it. I think the chance of it passing in the short to medium term are slim, both because it costs a lot of money for the government, but also it's just a little controversial. There's still a large number of members of Congress that just are not comfortable with putting mandates on employers, even if they're kind of light touch mandates. And so those bills probably aren't going anywhere, but they are notable because that's a direction a fair number of people in Congress want to head. And I think they're particularly notable because now there are Republicans involved. There used to be kind of a Democratic thing, and now it's more leaning towards more of a bipartisan initiative. And that, that's kind of, I guess, that is the signal, right, that Congress is taking it seriously, when the two parties kind of come together and say, we want to address it. And they still disagree about all kinds of things, but they've unified, they're unifying, or in the process of unifying around potential, at least a menu of potential solutions.
Do you get a sense of what changed? I mean, that kind of universal, like you said, it was out there for a while, but this year was the first year we really did get a little bit of bipartisan interest. Was there did you see anything that would have catalyzed that?
I think there were two things. I think thing number one is there had been some bipartisan support for the auto IRA back in 2006-7. But when Congress passed the Affordable Care Act in 2009 and 10, that the concept of putting mandates on employers and on putting people into retirement plans and kind of creating public options and things like that, that all kind of became controversial, went off the table for years and years and years. That now we're, 14 years from the passage of the Affordable Care Act, so things have loosened up there a bit. But the second thing that happened is there's just a proliferation of state auto IRA programs. So about 19 states have passed legislation that would create state-run programs for uncovered private sector workers. And I think that you're starting to see, both from the service provider community and the employer community, complaints about having to deal with 50 different state laws and kind of navigate that patchwork quilt of state laws. And so there's some interest in creating a singular federal solution, so it's the same everywhere, even if you operate in two different states.
Okay. So real quick, and it's a big topic, we'll talk about it real quick. There are a couple of parts of the Social Security that also touch the public sector. So you probably have read in the news that Social Security, there's talk about the trust fund and how the trust fund, they call it running out of money, but really it's just kind of an excess, and the trust fund is going to disappear. And when that happens, contributions and withdrawals have to equal out. So there's a lot of talk about Social Security, because if that happened, the benefit would go down. It kind of changes every year. It looks like around 17 to 20% is the number that they landed on this year. But Michael, can you talk a little bit about, there are a couple of there's a bill out there right now that affects the windfall elimination program and the government pension offset, those two programs. They have a ton of co-sponsors, but it seems unlikely that they're going to go anywhere from what I've seen. Can you talk about those real quick and why they might be of interest to public sector plans?
Yeah, sure. So there's these laws that kind of were intended to prevent kind of double dipping, for lack of a better word, by uh, by limiting the Social Security benefits for people that have public sector pensions, basically. And those when those were originally created, they were intended to make it so people didn't get a benefit, get more of a benefit than they should be entitled to. They have some weird, some effects that are punitive in a lot of ways. And there's been a push to repeal those provisions for years and years and years. And that has usually a lot of bipartisan support. The challenge is just back to the cost, that those bills are extraordinarily expensive, that because the intent of them was to reduce the amount Social Security spends, the federal government spends, that when you repeal them and the government spends more money, it costs the government a lot more. And so while they have bipartisan support and they've gotten down the path pretty far at various times, they never get across the finish line just because it would cost a lot of money to make the changes, and Congress has to find that money from somewhere, and it's usually from somewhere that has political opposition to a change, and so we're just kind of stalled, waiting for them to figure out how, as a policy matter as a cost matter, to get these things across the finish line. And it's been that way for a decade plus, maybe 2 decades. It's a long time.
And it seems like in the context of what's going on with Social Security right now, and the fact that the fixes are probably either higher. I mean, it has to be higher taxes or lower benefits right now, right? It's kind of your only options. That adding in some more expense doesn't seem super likely, but it does have a lot of at least a lot of nominal support on the bills, right?
Yep.
So one other thing, and I'll just touch on this briefly. I haven't seen it really proposed anywhere, but there was a Congressional Research Service study that talked about also universal coverage for state and local employees as an option for Social Security to bring in revenue. So as you think about it, if you added all of those states like Ohio and Massachusetts and all those teachers and cops and firefighters out there who aren't part of Social Security, if you added them to the rolls of Social Security, that would bring in a lot of revenue for the system. That is true. It would also be quite a political move, and it would also run into the conversation that we have often about what is the federal government allowed to do, and are they allowed to preempt state rules? And so I haven't seen that thrown out there other than in that context, but I know that that's been floated a few times in the past. I don't see anybody trying to champion it, but it is something to consider. And it also goes to, we got a question about ERISA. Was there any conversation about, as we mentioned earlier when we were talking about the emergency savings accounts, because we're non-ERISA plans, we have to have different considerations. Was there any talk about, forcing government plans into ERISA? We get into the same conversation about, is the federal government going to, force states to run their plans a certain way? There isn't any appetite for that. Nothing that I've heard. I don't anticipate anything like that happening. And there are some very bright lines that I think they would have to cross to make that happen. For those of you who follow it, it's also the reason that it's difficult for us in the public sector to get auto enrollment laws passed, because auto enrollment is something that the federal government has implemented through the 2006 bill and other bills. We're always carved out of that, and we're carved out of that because they don't want to override state and local laws. And so because of that, each of you in your own jurisdictions has to get auto enrollment passed on a case-by-case basis, which makes it much more painful and slow. So realize that all those issues are kind of intertwined. And we want to be careful about maintaining the fact that government, state and local plans can do their own thing. But there are places where administratively, like getting rid of the first day of the month rule, it does help to streamline things. So we're always trying to strike that balance. Had a couple other questions. I think Dee just said she hopped off, but she had a question about the age 50 catch-up, the $145,000 for the age 50 catch-up. Does that apply to the 60, 61, 62, 63 catch-up that they added in Secure 2.0? Is it that same Roth treatment that you would get? Michael, you want to cover that one?
Yeah, I think we're waiting on guidance for all that,
Yeah.
but yeah, it seems like that's likely the case.
Yeah. And again, an area where we do need more guidance. So hopefully D checks out the recording. We have asked for guidance on that and we're still waiting. It's same kind of part of the same package of information that we need from the IRS. There's a lot to clean up. It was a very big bill. We had one other question about unforeseen emergencies, hardships, and feedback on self-certifying those. Generally, I would say from the conversations that I've had with folks that are looking into those provisions, it's very much personal preference or organizational preference, cultural preference. Do you want to offer more flexibility, or do you feel like it would be better to put some guardrails on things? I think it's very much I would say 50-50 on preferences for those. It doesn't seem like there's a strong preference one way or the other, and everybody's just weighing it with their committees and determining, how strict do they want to be about letting assets out of the plan, and how much do they want to make retirement assets available to those who are trying to save. Because we all know that if you keep the money in, it tends to work out a little better, but we all know that things come up in life, so there's that balance to strike. Michael, anything else you want to add? And if you have any other questions, please fire away. Any final thoughts?
No, it's just the only thing I'll say is it's going to be an interesting year. Election years are always kind of interesting. But then 2025 with the expiring tax cuts, there will be a lot going on in our space. It's anytime they open up the tax code and really do a lot of work, it's going to implicate us in some way, shape, or form. And so we'll stay vigilant and we'll keep everybody in the loop.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll be working hard this year. For those of you who wonder and want to know what's going on, we'll continue to try to keep you updated. Tune in at the conference. We're going to have a legislative session. We moved it up from Wednesday, so you don't. For those of you who have late flights, by popular demand, we are not going to try to make you stick around to watch Michael present at the conference. So we're moving that up in the week so that everybody's able to attend. It'll be an important year and important conversations. We're going to be in Washington. I'm going to be in Washington quite a bit, hanging out with Michael and the folks from Groom to have conversations on the Hill. But as we go, if you have questions or member feedback, obviously very important to all of this process. If you have information that you're seeing, or these provisions or future provisions are affecting your plan in certain ways, let us know, because that informs the advocacy that we're able to put out there. So again, Michael, always a pleasure. Mustache looks great. It's been a great time. Very informative. I hope you all enjoyed it. Thank you to everybody for coming today, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, everybody.